Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our series on the advent of the new Procurement Act 2023. I can sense the feeling of febrile excitement in the air now that the new act has finally come into effect as of a little after midnight on the 24th. So it's what better time to embrace the new legislation and give you the benefit of what we've managed to figure out about it so far. So over to you, Gemma, to get things kicked off. If we are, yeah, we have people joining. Should we give it a minute?
Say, we'll give it a minute. Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all. We're just waiting for people to join. I can see that the numbers are going up. We'll just give them another minute just to make sure that we get as many people as possible before we start. Sorry, just a housekeeping thing, Dan. Am I dealing with the slides? I forgot to ask you.
No, I've got them here.
Excellent, thank you. Right, okay, the numbers are still going up. I'll just give it a few more seconds and then we'll get started. As I said, good morning to everybody who's joining us. Welcome to the final procurement webinar. As Dan said earlier, I'm sure you're all waiting with bated breath and excitement for this after it's finally come into existence. Okay, so should we get things moving then?
Yeah, let me bring up the slides. And we are good to go.
Okay. So as you can see, everybody, I'm Gemma Duxbury. I'm a partner in the commercial team here, and I support Dan, who is the main oracle and expert in procurement. As you know, we've been doing these webinars. I think this is our fourth one, just a series in line with the introduction of the Procurement Act 2023. This one's rather exciting, though, because a couple of days ago, it actually came into existence. So as this title says, I love it, Dan. I love where you get all these song lyrics from. So get ready for this. Here we go. This is what's coming. And we're now going to take you through the final stages of this webinar series. So in this session, we're going to be covering, how did we get to where we are? We're going to try and do a brief recap of sessions 1 to 3, just to remind you and to trigger some memory of what we've already discussed, because it is a lot to take in, particularly, I think, all the notices webinar. That was quite a big one. I've read the very riveting National Procurement Policy Statement, which we've all been waiting for. And worth the wait, I don't know if it is the answer to that, but I will talk to you about that shortly. And then we're going to cover the central digital platform, which Dan has had the joy of discovering in the last couple of days, because obviously we need to be registered as a supplier. And then we're going to have a look at some of your questions and our recommended next steps. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Dan.
Yep. So
I shall hand over to you.
Yep.
And leave them in your capable hands.
Yep. You will see a pattern emerging, ladies and gentlemen, that I've decided to crowbar in references to some of my favourite bands, because this is the last one in the series. So we'll kick off with The Fall. And it has been the bane of your life waiting for this. If you work in procurement, you've doubtless been having to explain to colleagues, as I have over about the last 18 months, no, it hasn't happened yet. No, it hasn't changed yet, but it's going to be really important when it does. And it's been quite difficult to keep colleagues focused on the changes when they kept getting moved back and the guidance was a bit vague. So at least now here we are, we've had enough time, it's making a start. So let's quickly recap where we've got to. And I think what we have to say at this stage is, if it feels like the starting gun's just gone off, where have you been? Because this is a bit like the Olympics. You've got 4 years to know it's coming, what with the white paper and the legislation and all the rest of it. So it really shouldn't be the bee of the bang just at the moment. Ideally, what you should be doing at the moment is putting the finishing touches to your plan so that any new procurement you're about to start, to which the new rules will apply, can go off as smoothly as possible, and you can play the new rules to your best advantage. So it has come to this, but it's been coming to this for quite some time. So let's move to our recap section. Now, I'm pleased to say at this stage that somebody is here to help you, and there is just about time to have a recap. But that said, you are to some degree on your own, and this echoes the point in the Too Unlimited quote we had at the start. You've got to mind your own biz. This will work differently for everybody. It's a bit like GDPR in the sense that there are some rules, but within that, the onus is on you to explain that you are doing it in a way that is within the rules. Subject to that, you've got quite a lot of leeway, and certainly more than you used to have under the Public Contract Regulations 2015, RIP. Well, not RIP because they're still around, as we'll mention in a minute. It's very much the Banquo's ghost in this, because they really ought to be gone by now, but they're not. So there is a gap, and the gap is a significant change in how procurement will look and feel. A lot more notices, a lot more transparency, a lot more, from the point of view, I have to say, as an organisation that bids for these contracts, quite probably a lot more inconsistency. Because as different organisations choose to use the new rules in different ways, we're going to have to recalibrate every time we do a bid if everybody decides to do it differently. Doesn't say that people shouldn't do that. You should set it up the way that works for you if you're the buyer. And those of us on the supply side are just going to have to get used to it. So where have we gone to in our previous 3 sessions? Well, session 1 was about the Public Contract Regulation 2015 and which elements of it you might want to carry on using while you still can. Now, that's changed now, because anything you haven't previously done in terms of the award of the contract or the procurement process would now have to start under the new rules. Contracts awarded under the old rules, and even awarded now under a process that's governed by the old rules, will still be governed by the old rules. So a lot of the post-award contract notices and that sort of thing, you potentially won't be needing to publish for your existing contracts. It doesn't suddenly switch on over everything you're already doing. So that effectively was where we were going with session 1. So anything you had the chance to do beforehand, you got that done, or we'll be looking for a way to do it with minimum publicity under the new rules. Session 2, lots of change. Plenty happening. So recapping then what we talked about in that session, looking at the life cycle of a contract from beginning to end, preliminary market engagement's now been formalised. So if you start your PME now, you will have to do it under the rules as they are now. So not only is a new procurement's caught, new pre-procurement market engagement is also caught now. The fixed procedures have gone. There's now only open and competitive flexible if you're starting now. What is competitive flexible? It is anything with 2 stages. And that's it. That is the extent of the legislation and the regulations. As Gemma's mentioned in previous sessions, the Government Procurement Pathway website has published a essentially massive ITT style document, which has in all conceivable methods of doing a competitive flexible process, which is fine, but you probably can't just publish that. There might be too much in it for you safely to be able to use it. We now have dynamic markets. You can't now create a new dynamic purchasing system unless you'd already started before the law changed. So bearing in mind, dynamic markets are not the same as a DPS. A dynamic market is a funnel, which allows you to restrict who is allowed to bid in a competitive flexible procedure, because that is entirely what it says in the legislation. So they sound the same, but they're not the same. We have open frameworks and frameworks. So old style 4-year frameworks with which we're all familiar, those are still a thing. You are now able to procure the up to 8 years worth of open framework, but within that 8 years, you must reopen the framework, I think by my calculation, at least twice. And depending on how many people you're allowing to be suppliers on the framework, the rules for those reopenings will be different. So what you can't do is necessarily just reopen it and say, well, the people who were already on it are staying on it, and that's the extent of my process. I don't think you would be able to get away with an approach like that. You would have to create the possibility of new tenders coming in at that midpoint. We have wider discretionary exclusion. And the wider discretionary exclusion in question is the ability to exclude under paragraph 13 in the relevant schedule now for poor contract performance in a public contract short of termination. So a contractor who has been rubbish, but not rubbish enough to sack, or rubbish so late in the contract that it wasn't worth sacking them, and we have seen both, is still possibly subject to discretionary exclusion. We now have the debarment list, and any application of an exclusion, mandatory or discretionary, is now reportable by the contracting authority so that the government can decide whether or not to put that contractor on the debarment list. And that is the debarment list that every authority must look at before they award a contract to check whether that is a contractor that they could have excluded. Briefly noting, when we talk about central digital platform in a minute, there are exclusion grounds on there, and I'll explain why those things are potentially a little bit different. More scope to vary contracts. There is a new ground for variation that's been added into, I'm going to say off the top of my head, Schedule 8, I think, which has replaced what used to be Regulation 72. Well, still is Regulation 72 for older contracts. So rather like when the Companies Act changes and various other things, we've got to keep both versions in mind. So one of the tricks as a procurement advisor or manager going forward is you just need to remember which set of rules are we under for each particular contract. Now, in circa 4 years' time, you won't have that problem anymore because all your current contracts should have washed through and been replaced by new ones under the new legislation. And by then, we'll probably know how it works. So it might be the case that if you were smart enough to place all of your contracts in the last 6 months, you may have a number of years before you have to get to grips with this. But the new scope to vary is for events foreseeable as a risk at the time of the contract, but which couldn't be dealt with by a specific contract variation clause. So that's broadening the old ground one under Regulation 72. We are going to talk a little bit more about the central digital platform. So I had the joy, with the assistance of my BIDS team colleague Tracy, of working through that yesterday. So I will share that fascinating story with you. And as Gemma's already said, there are many, many, many more notices being published these days, and there's just no way around that. That is one of the key pillars of the new legislation. So in session 3, we got to looking at all of these new notices. So fortunately, you don't have to stand in the town square in a tricorn hat and shout out the details of all of your payment history, but you do have to publish it on the internet every 6 months, unless you're a school. I should point that out. We'll probably pick up the schools exemption again later because it has been a very popular topic of questions in between our presentations. So lots and lots of notices. We touched on these in session 3. There are 26 different things you have to publish, famously the A to Z list in the Procurement Regulations 2024, bearing in mind these start before you commence your procurement. If you've got planned procurement notices or pipeline notices, you've got to get those out ahead of time. Preliminary market engagement is out there now, and that's the subject of publication. We've got the new ability to refine award criteria in the course of the process, so you'll have to publish that if you're doing that as well. We've got the new style award notice, and this is the one where you have to specify for contracts under 5 million how many bidders there were who had their tenders taken to final assessment, as well as a lot of other information. And for contracts over 5 million, you have to name all of the losing bidders who made it to the final round. So they say all publicity is good publicity if they spell your name right. It remains to be seen whether bidders are going to consider it really good publicity for it to be posted on a government website that they didn't win. So we'll have to take a look at that, see whether that changes any attitudes to how far through the process people want to stay in it. The contract details notices is where you state the KPIs that you've applied to your contract, or the reason why you're not applying at least 3 KPIs when the regulations and the Act say that you should. And also for contracts over 5 million, a copy of the contract itself. So I think what we're looking at there is capturing whether the contract has signed is any different to the one that went round with the ITT that everybody else has seen, just to spot whether there's been any delicate, what we usually refer to as clarification, which is to say amendments that you normally can't make between the conclusion of the process and the signing of the contract. We've then got payment compliance notices where you as a contracting authority must publish every 6 months how many of your invoices you paid within 30 days, 60 days or longer, and essentially rate yourself as a prompt payer of public contracts. We've then got contract performance notices, which are a wholly new thing, your ongoing obligation once a year to publish a rating in one of 5 categories, Ofsted styly, against all of your contractors under each public contract, against all of the KPIs. So previously, KPIs, something you could have used behind the scenes, possibly to apply a little pressure to a contractor or apply a lot of pressure to a contractor. Now that result is getting published. So if you've got a contractor that's not doing what they should, there is the higher incentive on their part to get it right before you publish the assessment, but equally, you can't not publish it. So they can't promise to get it right if you won't publish, you've still got to publish. Contract change notices. So any amendments to the contracts, we've got those coming out now. We've got transparency notices, that sort of thing. And we've now got contract termination notices, which weren't a thing before. So all the way through from before the contract starts, through the procurement process, the award stage, the actual conduct and performance of the contract, even up to the point that the contract has ended for any reason at all, including the expiry of time. So what I think that is partly looking to catch is contracts that are allowed to run on beyond the time when they should have finished. Because technically they have terminated unless they have been extended, and any extension of them would arguably require a contract change notice. So in theory, it shouldn't be possible to run a contract on without admitting that you're doing it. So everybody should be able to tell when you should be reprocuring the contract. In fact, the tender notice for restarting the new procurement should have gone out before the contract termination notice. In theory, by the time that contract termination notice goes out, the new contract should be up and running and ready, mobilized. So think about the sequence of all of those things will happen in now. So if only somebody in government had given us a really clear steer on what you're supposed to do with all of the freedoms that the new legislation offers you. And with that thought in mind, over to you, Gemma.
If only they had, I think is the thing I would say. I don't know about anybody else, but we've been waiting for this, the latest procurement statement to come out and answer all our prayers, answer all our questions and explain how this is going to work and everything's going to be fabulous. And I think the only word I can use to describe my reaction to the latest statement is probably deflated, I think would be the best way to describe it. So obviously, we've got this slide here just to outline it. It was released on the 13th of February and didn't, to be honest, really answer many of my questions, I think is the point I wanted to make here. But however, it does outline some things, which I'm going to briefly take you through. I think a lot of it already covers what we kind of expect procurement to deliver anyway, in any event. So what it effectively focuses on is the broader national policy objectives as are listed there. So it's all very much tied into what the government want, how they want to move things forward, which includes kickstarting economic growth, taking back our streets, becoming a clean energy superpower and breaking down those barriers to opportunity. And that specifically relates to your SMEs and VCSEs, which I'll talk about. So it's all about those things, and it's also one of the other main objectives as well as improvement of the NHS and making that a better system that we have. There's a huge focus on value for money. It's all about driving this economic growth and strengthening those supply chains by giving SMEs and the VCSEs a fair chance at these public contracts, making sure that high quality jobs are created and to champion innovation. That's the idea behind the kickstarting the economic growth. And it also focuses on contracting authorities delivering social and economic value that supports those government missions. And that can also include working in partnership across organisational boundaries. You have to ensure that you have the right commercial capability and that you have the right standards in place to make sure that those contracts which you are going to procure and manage deliver this best value. There's very, very much a high focus on the value for money, which has always been there. That's always been part of procurement, but it really seems to have elevated that up to another level. It's, as we've mentioned here, it's about giving that access to public contracts. And we've included a sentence there about thinking twice on fee-bearing private frameworks. And that's because the actual note, it says that they are going to shine a spotlight on framework providers who charge excessive fees. So you need to, sort of be aware of that situation because they are going to be looked at and focused upon. And it's also about helping contracting authorities to collaborate and deliver efficiencies through joint procurements rather than just having individual ones. And it's about benchmarking against other bodies and learning from best practice so that you can finally achieve that value for money at the end of it. And you also need to make sure that you have the capability to benefit from those commercial tools to help deliver that value for money. So a lot of the wording of the statement all points back to this really big focus on value for money. As I've discussed in previous webinars, there's a lot of reference to the playbooks that the government have provided as part of their support in relation to the new Procurement Act. So there's a commercial one, I think there's a construction one, digital and data, consultancy, I think was another one. So this is all through that commercial function government website, which I've signposted you to before, and it refers you back to the guidance in those playbooks. So as we said there, it's about as well you going and looking at that guidance, looking at those playbooks, taking into consideration what they're saying. But other than that, the statement really is the focus on these broader policy objectives and really pushing that value for money, opening this up to the smaller businesses to give them the opportunities to also apply for those contracts. So I think that's about as much as I can say, Dan, because there wasn't a right lot more in the statement.
Well, I think that interestingly, it's possible to read quite a bit between the lines. And I think that the reason I put the Crown Commercial Service logo in the top right corner is this is a pretty clear direction that people aren't using the CCS frameworks when the government thinks they should be doing.
Yeah,
Because
and
even in public sector frameworks, the statement says there are too many of them.
yeah.
And that connects to, as a supplier on the CCS legal services framework, other suppliers are available, but we are certainly one of them.
And the best.
We have to send a return in every year, and one of the questions we are asked by the CCS every year is, of contracts of the kind that could have gone through this framework, have you had work that didn't go through this framework when it could have done, and if not, why not? And explain why that was the case. And we've had to write back each time and say we haven't done anything wrong. Why did work go elsewhere? Well, work went elsewhere because there are other sector purchasing networks that are more trusted or more established or operated by organizations in the sector itself. For example, I know from a project Gemma and I worked on for a motorway junction improvement, the framework through which an awful lot of highways engineering contracts are placed is run by 6 local authorities. And other local authorities use it because they know the people who run it.
Exactly.
And there are purchasing networks run by housing associations for other housing associations. I know because I'm working on one of them. And equally, schools for schools. It's out there. So
yeah, there has been a big push as well on training through Crown Commercial Service as well, Dan. I would say actually a lot of the guidance and support available now is actually found more through CCS than it is through anywhere else because they've been I've been getting regular emails and updates from them with links to webinars and things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they're certainly making a push because there's an awful lot of those people somewhere in Liverpool, I think at the moment, wondering where all the customers are. because these things have been set up and they are not getting the use that you might imagine. So bear that in mind. And in fairness, if you could buy exactly the same service through CCS and pay a lower handling fee, it's probably worth looking at. It may not be appropriate, but I would advise anybody who isn't using CCS to at least have documented why they're not using it, because I would imagine somebody sooner or later is going to ask the question. And the point there about the sourcing playbook public interest test is there is a reference buried in one of the paragraphs of the statement that organizations should consider whether they actually need to outsource at all, and whether actually they could do something themselves with their own resources rather than necessarily paying somebody else a profit margin to do it. So whether that is,
which all points
yeah,
back to the VFM, doesn't it?
Well, it's one oblique reference, but whether there is a suggestion there that one way to really achieve the procurement policy statement objectives is to in-house it and do it straight out of a public body without any external involvement. I mean, that is certainly, arguably, when it works, a VFM solution. On the other hand, it is not always a managed risk solution. It's not always a scalable solution, and it may not always be the solution that works for your organization. So we can take some pointers from it. And the reason we've said at the top, who cares, is pursuant to Section 13 of the Procurement Act, if you are a central government body, you must have regard to this guidance. You simply must. And all contracting authorities should really be looking at it. So
that also applies to educational bodies, Dan, under the exemption. They still have to adhere to this statement as well, even though they're exempt.
Yeah, well, and certainly that, we'll come to that. I think plus we'll do that as an optional question. The exemption for schools is not as big an exemption as some people have hoped it would be. So let's move on from there to the other manifestation that only came into existence on the 24th, the central digital platform. I have to be very careful not to call it single central register. So for those of you in education, apologies if I make that slip. There's an awful lot of similar things being created at the moment. So, of course, a bit of Daft Punk, because why not? It will lift the mood a little. So what is this? Well, if you haven't been to Find a Tender since it changed on the 24th, this is what the sign-in page of Find a Tender now looks like. So how you sign in has changed. You now need a gov.uk one login. So crack on and get yourself one of those if you haven't got one. A few other things to note as we take a look around the page. I've stuck a few arrows on to help you see the key bits. Great news, it's the beta version. So who doesn't like being used for a bit of live beta testing after the law's already changed? Excellent news. So similar to the Charity Commission, similar to Companies House, there's a bit of an admission that it might not work the way you want it. And I have to say, to borrow the words of our IT director, it was running like a dog yesterday. But that, I assume, was the thousands of people who had to register on it. So possibly they created a bit more demand than they wanted. So above the sign-in, you can still search. So great news for us. We can still look out there and see who wants to hire some lawyers, which is excellent news. But notice then the bits down the bottom, if you can squint and see the little writing clearly enough, certainly over on the right, supplier information. After signing in and complete your supplier information, that's not quite grammatically sound, but we'll move on, to be able to bid for contracts. Oh no, there you go, register as a supplier after signing in. There we go. To be able to bid. So until you have filled in the supplier information for open, competitive, flexible, and direct awards, you cannot be awarded the contract or bid without having your supplier information filled in on this website. Because once you go in, there are about 6 categories you have to fill in, and we'll come to those on the next slide. And then at the bottom, there is a link that says, share your supplier details. And once you've filled it all in, if you click that, it generates a code or a link, which you can then use to submit as part of your bid. So you will not be filling in selection questionnaire or PQQ or whatever you still call it anymore. All of the basic information is coming from this platform. So don't be asking those questions again as an authority. What you should be doing is saying, provide us your core supplier information from the central digital platform. So there it is. Get accustomed to it, because it is what it is. It is the new version. So pausing to notice that if you've never seen Bouncers by John Gobber, it's an excellent play. Well worth a night out. 4 stars, Forbes solicitors. But what's on there? What do you have to do before you are allowed to bid? So quite literally, if your name is not on the list, you are not coming in, because you are not allowed to bid. So you've got to put in the core supplier information. So that's basic information. Who are you? What's your registered office address? What's your company number, etc. Economic and financial standing information. So that's at least 2 years worth of accounts, or an explanation why not. Connected persons information, which is largely the same as your persons with significant control register, such as you would find at Companies House if you're a limited company or an LLP, or also in some senses the beneficial owners of your organisation. So there's quite a bit of guidance there to help you understand who are the connected persons. But what that means is you've got to put the names of individuals up there as well as just the organisation itself. So what's going on here is people are looking for conflicts of interest. They're looking for, hang on a minute, that's one of our board members. They never told me they were anything to do with this organisation. Now I'm going to find out, because now they've had to disclose it. And exclusion grounds information. So this is the usual bit you would have had in a selection questionnaire, where you have to go all the way through the list and say, no, we haven't been convicted of that offence, or that one, or that one, or that one. New items in that list, as we've mentioned in previous sessions, including some pretty heavy offences that surprisingly weren't in it before, such as corporate manslaughter, that sort of thing. But also the discretionary exclusion grounds, you've got to fess up to any of those applying to you as well. So what is the difference between you registering exclusion grounds that might apply to you and the government choosing to put you on the debarment list? Because that is a list which guarantees, if your name is on it, that you are definitely not coming in, because it is like the big list of shoplifters stuck on the door of Home Bargains. If you are on it, you are not welcome. So the debarment list requires the government to assess not only that an exclusion ground applies, but also that they consider that exclusion ground is likely to continue to apply. So it's a little bit like the old self-cleaning formula from the old regulations, where if it's in a relevant period, and I think from memory it's 5 years, if it's in that period, it counts. If it's dropped out of that period, then it's too far in the past to be relevant anymore. And certainly, I think as the rules stand at the moment, you can't use anything before the change of law. So potential exclusion grounds that existed based on behaviour before the 24th of February, you might have a little difficulty with on the poor performance discretionary exclusion ground. Criminal offences are still what they are. You can't wash those off. And bearing in mind, use of this is compulsory. So no option on that front. So, bit of Radiohead to ease us into the question section, which on this occasion we're going to do a little bit before the final recommendations, because what we'd like to do is ideally finish on what we really think you need to know about how the new legislation is going to work. So we're going to get into the questions now. We did ask some questions in advance, and thank you to those of you who have sent them in. We've got 3 to talk about here, and helpfully we've got another one in this morning that was breaking news after I'd finalised the slides. So we're going to pick that one up as best we can. I think I know how I would go about answering it. I haven't necessarily had time to look the answer up yet, unless somebody has done it while I've been blathering on. So I'm going to cross my fingers for that and wait and see. So let's start. Questions so far. Do Forbes have a model procurement policy for schools and academies with updates ready for the new Act? Well, the answer to that is not as such. Because the thing with a procurement policy, much in my view as it is for a data protection policy or any other kind of policy, elements of it are unavoidable. You have to say you're going to comply with the law, because what else could your policy possibly be? But beyond that, your policy is where you capture what your organization wants to achieve through the medium of procurement. And different organisations, as the Act now permits, might be trying to achieve different things, even within the constraints of the Academy Trust Handbook, with which Gemma and I as school governors are all too familiar. Even within that, you still have got a little bit of leeway. And bearing in mind that there are schools with religious character, there are schools that have different objectives and focuses, then I wouldn't advocate necessarily having a one-size-fits-all procurement policy, because particularly with the way the new legislation works, it's important to understand what you're looking to achieve. Now, that said, once a governing body of a school has concluded what it is that it wants to achieve, then we can very readily help you putting the policy together. So we're not washing our hands of procurement policies, but what we're saying is, if we give you one and say this will do, with the law as it now stands, that's not necessarily the right approach as we would see it. When the law was a lot more prescriptive, it was a lot easier to say, well, you haven't really got any options. This is what you have to say you're going to do. Whereas now, quite a lot more leeway, meaning that it might be necessary to have a bit of a think about it first and clarify at a strategic level, i.e. Governing body level, what that policy is trying to achieve, what are the objectives, and then the policy can be aligned to those. Anything to add on the first question, Gemma? Was that just about there?
No,
Okay, number two.
I think it's our usual thing of there's not one size fits all, Dan, isn't there? I think that's the thing for me. It's not a case of we're not ready for it. We absolutely are ready for it, but it all depends on what you require and what your position is. It's different for everybody.
And this is why we've chosen to do the recommendations at the end. So we're going to talk about those last as a closing topic. You will have the slides, you will have the recording of the session. So what we hope is the bit at the end, I'm not saying print it out, laminate it and tape it over your screen. It's not quite that important, but certainly keep a copy handy if you want to be talking your board of directors, your trustees, your governors, whoever the decision makers are in your particular organisation, elected members as it may be. Let's talk through what is our policy, how are we going to do this? So question number two. Does form solicitors believe there'll be an increase in the need to provide advice and support to contracting authorities in relation to perceived increased challenges from bidders under the new procurement regulations? Yes, but I will expand on that answer. The reason for that is, under the old regulations, and therefore in relation to procurement still governed by them, there were only really a couple of points where there could be a challenge. There was exclusion from the process before the award, and then there was the award itself that could be challenged. And then you potentially had the challenge under the old press text case law and regulation 72 about how it should have been re-awarded if the contract was changed too much. But those were basically the three things you could take a swing at. There are so many more points in the process under the new Act and regulations where the way in which the customer, the contracting authority, chooses to perform its requirements can have an impact on the contractor. And we will declare an interest at this point. Of course, we are a contractor. We supply to many of you who are listening. So we've been figuring out what your side of this looks like, but we've also been taking a very close personal interest in what our side of this looks like. So at the moment, if we don't win or we're ruled out of a procurement when we don't think that should have happened, that's something we can talk about. If it comes to our attention that the contract in performance is nothing like the one that we bid on, we can maybe do something about that. Going forward, we're going to have all of these extra notices and processes that we could suggest hadn't been done properly. So for instance, even before we get to the award, we've got the new ability to refine the award criteria between publication of the tender notice and the award. So that's another thing that it's possible for disappointed bidders to argue with. If you told me you were going to change them, my bid would have been different. Or the one thing you're not allowed to do is you've changed your award criteria such that I wouldn't have been excluded originally because you've taken out the thing that knocked me out of the process. So we can now argue about whether refining award criteria has been done correctly or not. We've got the reopening in the middle of an open framework. Has that been done properly? Should I have been allowed to bid? Should that person have kept their place on the framework? So there's a new process there that people were using for the first time, and people who are on the wrong side of the outcome might want to suggest that the authority has misunderstood how to use those rules. We've then got all of these publications. And given that all contracting authorities are going to be publishing their KPI assessments on all contractors every year, that's quite a lot of reports if you've got quite a lot of customers scattered about the place in the public sector, certainly as we do. So we do have contact meetings, we have client relationship management sessions, and we would like to think if a client had an issue with the service we were providing, we'd have had that conversation with them. We certainly wouldn't like it if the first thing that we saw was a notice is published on the official government website suggesting that we're rubbish. Because lots of people can see it. Those are things that you can go and search for. It's right there to see. And bearing in mind that being rubbish in a public contract is a basis for being discretionarily excluded from a future one, we would be very concerned about any notices of that nature being published, as would be any other business who's potentially got something to lose in future contracts. So as those obligations come around to publish those KPI assessments, as we'd suggested in a previous session, KPIs are the new award criteria. If you're going to grade me at level 2 out of 5 or level 3 out of 5 or worse, level 4, how clear is your KPI formula that you can definitely tell me that that must be the correct answer? Because normally your KPI has a binary pass-fail figure in it. Is that going to be good enough going forward if you have to grade performance at 4 different levels? You might have to have 4 different levels, or at least a couple of options to differentiate quite good from terrible. So the basic way that KPIs have often been used in the past might come under some pressure here, given the consequences of KPI default being published. And if you initiate an exclusion, then that goes to the government to conclude whether that contractor should go on the debarment list, as mentioned a moment ago. There is a lengthy process, as you would imagine, set out in the regulations for the government reviewing whether you should be on the debarment list and then telling you, and you being allowed to appeal against that, and then the government reviewing it, and then you being able to go to court about it if you still don't like it. But what you can't do is sue the government for decisions made about putting you on the list. So presumably you're going to have a swing at the contracting authority who reported you in the first place and say, you got me into this when you shouldn't have done. Because it doesn't say that you can't take a pop at the contracting authority. It just says that you can't take a pop at the government. So again, if you initiate an exclusion, you should report it. That's how it has to be. Just bear in mind that that will not be the end of the story. For those who are in the education sector, it's pretty similar to deciding you're going to put a teacher up for being included on the barred list. That's your assessment that that person simply should not be allowed anywhere near a classroom ever again. And if the government agrees with you, that's that person's teaching career done and dusted. And sometimes that's absolutely the right thing to do, and where it is, you have to do it. But I know that anyone who works in the field will make that decision knowing that it's a career finisher. And publishing certainly the elevated form of performance notice where you specify that there's been breach of contract, that is potentially pretty heavy stuff for the contractor concerned as well. It also means, as we mentioned in session 1, you won't be able to sort it out with the contractor in the background, because you are going to have to publish some indication as to why that contract came to an end. So quite a lot of new things in the new act and the new regulation. So number one, new things tend to get disputed while how to use them settles down properly. But secondly, a lot of these new things have potentially far-reaching consequences for contractors, and I would expect potentially some pushback if you are considering initiating one of those processes. So question 3 is what impacts does the Act have in practice for tenders beneath the PCR limit? And credit to the person who wrote that, because it illustrates the point that you have to keep both the old and the new system in mind. Because as I said, like Banquo's ghost, the PCR is still hanging around, getting in the way of things while you're trying to move on. I'm not suggesting Macbeth was a particularly effective procurement manager. He got the job done, but it wasn't a sustainable solution. So what I think we need to think about is there's a change in nomenclature for one thing. Sub-threshold contracts used to be called sub-threshold contracts. You now have regulated below threshold contracts. So anything that used to be caught by Contracts Finder is now called a regulated below threshold contract. So for those sub-threshold contracts, and we were discussing this just before we came on the webinar, so correct me, Gemma, if I haven't remembered this correctly.
Yeah, I've done a bit more work on it, I think.
Which let's go for it. Over to you.
Yeah. So poor Dan, he's had to do the bulk of this, and this is one of the areas that I've actually looked at, so I can help on this one. So as Dan's explaining there, as you know, in the PCR and also in the new Procurement Act, because as Dan said, it applies to both. Depending on when you've done your procurement process, there are the thresholds. So these are the levels of cost and value of the contract. And this is what seems on the face of it quite a straightforward question about what impact does it have. You would think, well, it either does or it doesn't. Well, there isn't a clear answer, is the first point to make. So generally, as we've sort of said, there are what are considered to be regulated contracts and unregulated contract. Now, under Section 84, a regulated below threshold contract is a contract that's below the threshold, obviously, and is not an exempt contract as defined under Schedule 2, a concession contract, or a utilities contract. So those are the regulated contracts. Unregulated contracts makes it so that Part 6 of the Act does not apply to those that are exempted, utilities or concessions contract, or procured by a school, by a transferred Northern Ireland authority, or under a Northern Ireland procurement arrangement. However, even though we'd still have this distinction between regulated and unregulated below threshold contracts, there are still rules that apply to all below threshold contracts, whether they be regulated or unregulated. So here's just a list, and this is what I mentioned earlier on. The National Procurement Policy Statement, whoever you are, whatever you are, and whatever you do, for all below threshold contracts, you have to have consideration for those procurement policy statements for all procurements, and that's under Section 13 and 14 of the Act. You also have to have non-discrimination, so that this is all authorities cannot discriminate against suppliers from treaty countries when the procurement is covered by an international agreement listed in Schedule 9. So this applies to everybody, remember, this isn't anyone specific. And there's also rules on contract changes after awarding. Now, as we've discussed earlier, the rules on contract changes after awarding the contract only apply to contracts above the threshold. However, you must remember that if you change and increase that value in the contract, and that value then takes you over the threshold, so it was originally below, it's gone over, then it becomes, I don't know if you remember the funky looking convertible picture of a convertible car that Dan put on his slides, that becomes what's known as a convertible contract, because it's converting from under threshold to over threshold. So
if you need to find that, in the earlier section, it's the one introduced by the Frank Zappa lyrics.
Yeah. Who's Frank Zappa?
Oh, amazing sort of.
I'm going to get told off for that by Dan later. I'm telling you.
Sort of psychedelic rock musician.
Oh, well, that sounds good to me. I'm into that.
He was at it for a long time, was Zappa. He's done a load of different styles, and yeah,
I'll Google it after.
Yeah, you'll find some interesting stuff.
I'll Google it. So those are the things that are applicable to everybody, irrespective of whether it's whoever it is, it's a below threshold contract. So then we talk about the regulated contracts, which I mentioned before under the legislation. And the procurement for below threshold contracts, which are regulated, is less strict, obviously, than it would be for the larger contracts. And so you do have more flexibility. So there's no strict requirement to advertise. There is, however, a maximum of 2 notices. So if it's a regulated below threshold contract, you still need to publish a below threshold tender notice and the contract details notice. So you might not have to do any of the other 26 or however many there is, but you still do have to do those 2. But also you have the ability to limit the competition to local suppliers because it's a contract of low value. However, there's no set procedures for below threshold contracts. So you can still award a contract directly. You don't need to justify. You can invite a select group of suppliers to bid. You can limit competition, or you can run the open competition. But there are still restrictions. So there's no pre-selection stage. You have to consider and remove barriers that might prevent the SMEs from participating. Remember what we were talking about the fact that this is focusing in on those SMEs and VCSEs. There's no below threshold dynamic markets that can be created. And as we've said, that there are 2 mandatory notices. So it is a lot looser, but it still does have an impact. There are still things you have to be aware of. There are still notices you have to publish, albeit only 2 out of 26, but that you still have to do them.
So it's a little bit like the old contracts finder regime,
Yeah.
which is if you were advertising at all with a sub-threshold contract, which was over so you're under the big limit for applying the full rules, but you're also over the bottom limit for nobody caring. So you're in between. So effectively, for central government, you're in between for services 15,000 and about 220,000. So there's quite a range.
Yeah.
But you're in that gap. So previously, you would have had to advertise it on Contracts Finder, and you would have had to say you'd awarded it, and that's all you would have had to do. So you still have to do those 2 things. But as Gemma's also said, all of those background requirements come into play. And absolutely, one of the big new changes brought in by the new legislation is this concept of the convertible contract. So it used to be the case that if your original estimate that the contract was sub-threshold was valid at the time you made it, it did not matter if subsequent circumstances brought it over the threshold during its lifetime. The initial assessment stood, and that would still be right under the old regulations. But under the new ones, because the convertible contract has now been invented, it's definitely a thing. So look out for it. And not that I'm suggesting we've been involved in any situations of contracting authorities doing some fairly hooky looking calculations to suggest that something was sub-threshold, but probably wasn't going to be for very long. That, should that ever have happened, that was sort of okay at the time. Certainly something you could potentially have defended at the time. Now, it doesn't make any difference. If the value goes up, it just goes up. So consider if you've even got a price adjustment clause in there, and inflation kicks in at 11% like it did during lockdown, you could readily find yourself going over a threshold when you didn't anticipate that you were going to. So look out for that. All joking aside, look out for the impact of any massive international tariffs that might be coming our way soon if they start putting up prices in your supply chain. So it's not impossible that the cost of delivering contracts could be going up. But given inflation, it always is going up, but it might be going up faster than you expected. So it is sometimes worthwhile to be able to run your initial contract award as sub-threshold. If you then cross the line and your contract becomes convertible, it doesn't mean you have to cancel the contract and go and run a procurement. It just means you have to start publishing all the notices. So effectively, as I would imagine, from the point it converts, you then have 12 months to start publishing your KPI assessments and that sort of thing. And you then, any future changes will be potentially picked up by contract change notices and termination notices and all of the rest of it. So that's probably the big thing.
I mean, and that's only for regulated contracts, isn't it, Dan?
Yes,
for the unregulated,
right.
Obviously, it doesn't apply. So
yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's if it wouldn't have been a covered procurement to any value, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If you're an organisation to whom the rules don't apply, fine. But equally, some of those exemptions are on the basis that you're under the threshold. So by the time you go over it, so for example, let's briefly mention the schools exemption because it's coming sooner or later.
Yeah.
the schools exemption is limited to a very small number of things.
Mm.
And what I think we might do, with apologies to our colleagues in our events team who are probably already prepared to send the slides out, let us add another slide on what exactly is the extent of the schools exemption, because I think that's probably worthwhile.
Or you're
That
going to
we
be
can
in
put in.
trouble.
Well, I am, but I'm sure Hannah will be very understanding, as she normally is. We've worked through this because we have been asked a question, and
Yeah.
adding it to this slide deck is probably as good a way as any to publish it so that people can see it. Bad news for universities, I'm afraid to say, having looked into this in some depth. The definition of school in section 123 refers to the Further and Higher Education Act, and to a particular part of that that describes the further education sector, and the neighbouring definition in the same section is of the higher education sector. And I don't read that section as saying that a university can be in further education, because I think universities are always treated as being in higher.
Just to flag, Dan,
Yep.
as well as the additional question that we got asked before, we've actually got 8 through on the chat as
8,
well.
good
8.
grief.
I know.
Wow. Who knew? Okay. Well,
Okay, so are you ready? I think
yeah,
I can
yep.
answer the first one.
Is the first one our multi-academy trust question?
We can, well, yes, we can do that one
Right.
first if you like.
So we've had a question about whether contract valuation, which is topical as we're talking about the threshold, is measured across a multi-academy trust or can be split up between the schools within it. And well, as a former corporate lawyer now working in the education, housing and charity sectors, there's only the one company in a multi-academy trust. There only ever is.
Mm.
So legally, there is only one buyer.
Mm.
What we need to check before we put the answer to that question in the slides is under the old regulations, the 15 regulations, there is a bit of a loophole here where if an organization has departments that are run genuinely autonomously of each other, then it is possible to contract within those autonomous departments without aggregating the value of the contracts.
Mm.
What I would want to check for sure is whether that has been recreated in the new legislation and whether it's in the same terms as it was before. Because I have used that within MATs previously. I'd want to check whether that rule is still valid for new procurements that haven't started yet under the new rules. Okay, that's the one I'd already seen.
Okay, you ready?
Fire up the other ones.
Fire up the other ones. Prepare yourself. So I can answer the first one. Someone asked which 2 notices did we list for the regulated under threshold, and that was the below threshold tender notice and the contract details notice. Those are the ones that you have to use for regulated below threshold contracts. So that one's done.
Yep. So the contract detail, interestingly, not an award notice.
Yeah, I know.
But a contract details notice. That said, once you've published the contract,
I suppose they're kind of the same thing in
summary,
a way. Yeah, a bit more detailed than one. Right, the next question. So we've answered that one. Well, hang on, let me get my readers on. I'm at that age now where I can't just do it. How can we best give guidance on the changes to the Board of Trustees for MATs to enable them to discuss what strategic aims they may want to focus on?
well,
Also
now,
taking into consideration of the exemptions that schools have, which we've touched on and said that they're actually probably not as broad as we expected. Historically, the procurement policy was a tick box policy, which may not have had the gravitas that it should have had in the past, and given that schools have some exemptions.
Well, let's say not in the education sector per se, but certainly in another regulated charitable sector, I was at a board away day delivering a session on the new Procurement Act and how to get to grips with it. If you'd like us to come and have a chat to your governing body, fine. If you'd like us to spend a little time with your finance officer or school business manager with a view to enabling that person to go and do it, yeah, we'd be happy to do that. And I think that would probably represent a reasonable value for money service. You could invite them to go and have a look at any of the large array of guidance that the government's published. Although without, speaking as a school governor, without presuming too much on their valuable time, that might be an awful lot to ask them to go and read. I'm not sure I've made it through all of it yet. So I think,
and plus people say we speak a different language.
It's true.
Dan, as lawyers, but I tell you what, some of these guidances are in another language to me.
So I think, so well, what we're coming to shortly, introduced by I think probably the best lyric slide anywhere in the 4 sessions, is it is a list of questions you could legitimately ask your board to
Mm,
answer, and that might be a start. You could send them home with the questions and see what they come back with, but it might be simpler to say, okay, these are the types of procurements we do that you would need to think about. So commonly in a school, you're looking at
yeah,
catering, you're looking at cleaning, you're looking at grounds maintenance, which is always a nightmare, and that's not my fault. It just is, unfortunately.
yeah.
There are some very shocking grounds maintenance providers out there at the moment, one of
Being a
whom we've
trustee of
fired all over.
two trusts, Dan, though, I don't think I'd be right happy you giving me loads of homework, to be honest. I'd much rather you were helping me
Well,
just
that's well, true
understand
enough. Yeah.
it.
And
Um,
yeah, so
yeah,
yeah, if you want the presentation to your trustees with
yeah.
gratuitous reference to rock music lyrics, then certainly that is on offer.
What more could you want?
Okay, next one.
Next question. Will it not be down to each local authority to amend the policy directly for their schools, not the governing body?
Depends on what kind of school we're talking about. Gemma and I govern as an academy school, so absolutely not in that case.
I'm
But
assuming this is
and
maintained.
absolutely, but given the
Yeah,
well, but that said, given the way it's going with the new bill, maybe there's a little bit more of this about than there used to be, and
it could
certainly in the
be, but I would
northwest, there's
say,
still a lot of this.
I would
It would
suggest
be,
the
yeah,
delegation, though, of the powers
yeah.
to the governing body from the council would mean that they would expect the governing body to do it.
Well, I think the issue from the point of view of the local authority is clarify within that delegation what exactly is being delegated. Absolutely, it's the local authority's money getting spent here within the remit of the budget allocated to the school. And if within that budget there is a little bit more freedom of action for the school, then the school's still got to decide how to exercise the degree of leeway that it does have.
Yeah, because governing bodies are generally appointed to carry out the actions of the local authority because obviously they make the big operational decisions, such as, are we going to academise?
Yep.
But behind that, there is the local authority who will have their own objectives and mission. And like Dan says, with the new Children's and Wellbeing Bill, there's going to be a lot more powers given back to local authorities. The concern for me is the lack of resource, the lack of understanding, perhaps, and the lack of knowledge. So for me, I think really the governing body should be taking this on as a preference. Obviously, it will probably have to be run past the local authority,
Yep.
but
Yeah, I
it
think
depends on the council, I think.
yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's probably appropriate for there to be at least some degree of dialogue from the local authority to its maintained school governing bodies. Now, it may be that there are strong policies that the council would like those governing bodies to follow through, even if they're not compulsory. So it will be certainly open to say, here is your local authorities, your LEA's suggestion as to how to do school procurement under the new rules. You could
Mm,
choose to depart from this, of course, but that would be your decision to take as an individual governing body.
right, you ready for the next one?
Depends what it is, but go on, let's try.
Yeah, do bear in mind we've not had a chance to look at all these, so bear with me. So we've got a question here about the new government portal. Is it for under or also for over threshold
Well,
contracts?
as we just said, there are two notices you have to publish for a
Yeah,
regulated below threshold contract. So for those kinds of contracts, yes, it is. So
yeah.
previously, the old separate contracts finder and FTS, finder tender service, now merged into one. FTS now seemingly does everything. And that's where you do your publication. There's a
I
disclaimer on the
think
front that that's not true if you're in Scotland in certain circumstances,
mm,
but I think I spotted something on it the other day to that extent.
I think it covers both, but it's mandatory for over. It's conditional use for under, I
Yes,
think.
yeah,
Yeah.
not all unders will have to go on it, but if it's a
No.
regulated under, then it will.
Yeah. I think we smashed that between us, considering we've not seen it before.
Yep.
Next one. I've seen a large number of below threshold contract notices published on Contracts Finder this week. The below threshold contract notice template is still available on the eSender portal that's used. Does the new UK4 tender notice only apply to above threshold procurements? I think that's the same question effectively, isn't it?
With a twist, because for the purposes, I think it's right to say, for the purposes of the implementation and transition regulation number 3, which is the one that draws the line in the sand about when the old
Yeah,
rules apply and the new rules apply, the
yeah.
publication of the notice is not necessarily the correct starting point.
No.
If the process had in fact already begun in a recognised
Started.
way, then
Yeah.
the old rules would still have worked.
Yeah.
So it arguably, because sub-threshold registered, so regulated sub-threshold contract is a creation of the new legislation,
Whew.
you could conceivably still have a sub-threshold contract to which the old rules might yet apply.
Mm.
But they will be falling off in number because it's a less formal process at that lower value level.
There's a statement more than a question here, Dan, which says, does anybody really believe the delay of the Procurement Act 23 go live was due to the National Procurement Policy Statement?
Well, considering what's in that National Procurement Policy Statement,
I would say
no.
not.
And considering how close to the activation of the Act it was finally published,
Yeah.
clearly not. We've been, every time Gemma and I bumped into each other in the office over about the last 3 or 4 months, we've been saying, has anybody seen this thing
Anyone?
yet?
Anybody?
Have we missed it? Did,
Yeah.
did they sneak it out in the Commons or something?
Yeah.
But yeah, given that templates for notices and what have you have only just started appearing, the search feature on Find a Tender as of the 24th, only then was it amended to show the ability to search for the new types of notice. I think there was clearly still getting ready in the background to my eye.
Next question. We are a supplier of print, so textbooks, workbooks, assessment papers, and digital products, online teaching tools, assessment centre, etc., to schools. Do we need to register to bid in case some of our schools or MATs need to use procurement process? What else do we need to do? Yeah, agreed.
Yes, go back to the slide with the 4 bouncers on. And that is it. If you are bidding in a regulated, I think it's a competitive procurement procedure, I think it's called.
Yeah.
The jargon. So that's open or competitive flexible. If you're in either of those, you've got to be registered there. I reckon from the experience of doing it yesterday, if you've got all your PQQ information to hand, you can probably do it in half an hour, if that.
So yes.
So yeah, but if you're flicking in and out, having to go and find the information, it will take you longer. So it might be worth having a look at it to see what it needs from you.
Yeah.
Then get your information, get it smashed out.
Poor Dan, I felt this pain yesterday. There's just a couple of comments now, Dan. The schools exemption slide will be really useful, so we'll make sure that we get that in for you, much to Hannah's disgust.
Well, I'm sure Hannah will be fine. And we were, Gemma and I were roped into doing a presentation a little while ago for an education procurement network manager. So it was unavoidable to address it there. So I think I may have a slide kicking around that we can import. And I think that slide might be appearing at the ISBOL conference you're going to.
Yes,
Gemma.
it will be. Yep, it will be, definitely.
So for anybody who doesn't get to see it live, somewhere on the South Coast,
I will be down there next week in Hertfordshire.
But other than that, we'll make sure we pop that on the slide
absolutely.
deck.
And the lovely lady has said, sorry, Hannah. Then we've had another comment. Fabulous, thank you. And I may well opt for the rock lyric presentation approach for trustees. They're going to contact us. So that's great. I think we've answered all of them now, Dan.
Okay, well, in which
case, you want to whiz to the recommendations?
Absolutely. We're a little over, but that was Gossa taking questions. So I think we're probably okay. So let's skip through that.
You've only got 2 left, I think.
Yeah, we have got 2 left, but let's pause for a moment to consider the
opening. Breathe.
Let's put the opening lyrics from Loaded by the mighty Primal Scream. Absolutely marvelous. This is the clip from I think it's Wild Angels, the 1966 biker movie that you'll all know at the start of the song. And if you don't know, go find it. So what are we saying here? Well, firstly, that cartoon, so credit there to Mark Anderson for hitting the nail exactly on the head. We can probably go as far as saying what you might do and what might obviously happen afterwards. The unintended consequences that might come of any change you make in your procurement approach, a little bit harder to do because, well, they are unintended. There is, however, a difference between unintended and really obviously going to happen. So do try to keep an eye out for the really obviously going to happen category. So if you were going to do this, how would you do it? And I've gone with Primal Scream instead of my usual Jean-Paul Sartre quote, which I've been using previously for this, which is, if I do not choose, I am still choosing. So obviously looking ahead some 70 to 80 years to when this was coming in, what Sartre meant at the time was if you use all the standard government stuff, you are choosing not to do anything different or better. There's no definitive right answer if you change nothing at all. You can choose to change nothing, but that is still an approach that you've chosen to take. So to recognize the lyrics, just what is it that you want to do? Do you want to spend as little as money as possible? Do you want to engage more with the charitable and social enterprise sector? Do you want local jobs for local people? Do you want to buddy up with other schools and do your buying that way? Do you want to establish a flexible policy that your maintained schools can use? Do you want to commission housing services in a way that meets the housing ombudsman requirement to address diversity as a result of his spotlight report, on which we've done presentations previously, or the new requirement for tenant voice in the revised regulatory framework? There's a lot of things you might try to answer through your procurement process. So what are you trying to do? And does the Procurement Act 23 make the thing you want to do easier or harder? Because it might make some things you want to do easier, in which case, great, take the opportunity. If it appears to be moving against what you want to do, so for example, thinking about the MPPS, if you're into paying private sector framework management fees, the government fairly clearly thinks you might want to think twice about that, but you may have a good reason for doing it. And then let's pick up the MPPS. Does it work for you? Can you see that policy statement and say, absolutely great, let's go and do the things that are in there that apply to us? Because that, in theory, should be a set of objectives that the government think the new legislation is capable of permitting. It's possible to stick to what you know. If you currently have a procurement policy or a standard invitation to tender or something like that, which set out one of the procedures under the procurement public contracts regulations, I should say, 2015, you can still use it, so long as it meets the very, very limited requirements of the Procurement Act 23. So section 54 time limits. Other than that, so long as it's non-discriminatory and it isn't obviously flawed, you could use it. So you could, in theory, your version of competitive flexible procedure could be the restricted procedure from the 2015 regulations. It would work if you don't want to do anything different. So you can keep it around. So this is probably where the Banquo's Ghost analogy breaks down, because you might actually want this thing to stick around for a long time, so you don't have to do anything different. On the other hand, were you sick of those restricted procedures that didn't let you do what you wanted to do, didn't let you negotiate to the extent you wished you could? Would you like to sweep that away and do something a lot more freeform? And you think that's a better way of getting what you need from your available providers? Or you would be able to do that within the limited restrictions of the new legislation, but not if you stick to the old procedures. What is your risk tolerance? I know for any regulated providers of social housing out there, the requirement is to set your risk tolerance as part of the governance and financial viability standard, code of practice and other compliance framework. You've got to have that in any organization, be it local government, be it schools, be it wherever, be it charities. As we've said just now, there is a risk of more challenge under the new rules. Do you want to sail into those choppy waters, or do you want to try to stay away from them? So if you don't want to have to report anybody, set some really soft KPIs that nobody can miss, and then you won't have to report anyone. But the question is, are you driving quality? Are you getting value for money? Or are you just trying to avoid falling out with contractors in a way that the new regulations are pretty clearly suggesting you should be setting out your stall to fall out with them if they let you down? And consider the likely response. I don't think I am breaching any massive commercial confidentiality. If the screen suddenly goes blank, I was, so you'll soon find out. If we are asked to provide an absolute raft of social value, environmental commitments, free training, careers days, mentoring, shadowing, etc., the price of our tender might go up because you're paying for the whole service. What we can't do is charge for the core service and then give an unlimited quantity of free stuff when it actually costs us money to do all of those things. So if you pile in with an ambitious list of social value, I should say, obligations, KPIs, environmental, and all the rest of it, fantastic. I'm here for that. We know how to write that clause, and it certainly can be done, and it is encouraged. However, it is probably going to have an impact in terms of the price of the bids. So consider some preliminary market engagement. And possibly, depending on how you read the bit of the Act that deals with preliminary market engagement, if you are consulting with the market about your policy rather than an individual procurement, that might or might not be preliminary market engagement of a type that you have to notify or publish information about. If you are simply consulting with providers to understand whether the generic thrust of your new procurement policy will be acceptable to them or it will be problematic, might be worth finding out, even if you do have to publish a PME notice. Because if you roll that policy out and nobody's bidding, then that is a colossal waste of time and effort, because you'll have to change it to generate some bids. So probably worth doing that. And get some advice. Make sure you know what it is you intend to do. Check that it does fit within the new legislation the way that you think it should. If you are anywhere in the field of being a school and you want to know about the scope of the exemption, we will put the slide in. I very much doubt that will be the absolute end of the story, because my experience of advising in that field is there's always a slightly different example that might have a slightly different answer. So we'll give you some generic information, but if you're not sure, find somebody you can ask. And that could be a trade body. Gemma's off to speak to ISBL in the education field. It could be your local authority if you're a maintained school. It could be National Federation if you're a housing association. There is help out there of which we are a part. So if you've got questions, mine and Gemma's emails are in the slides. Yep, give us a shout. But it is as much as, if you're going to go talk to your board about how would they like to approach it, you could almost start with questions as wide as these. Because the nuts and bolts of how you play that out through a policy or a written down procedure, you can't do that until you know what you're trying to achieve. So that brings us to the very end. So I think, to the gross embarrassment of my teenage daughter, I'm closing with a Tyler the Creator quote. She plays an awful lot of Tyler the Creator in the car, and I'm still trying to get accustomed to it, shall we say. But to everybody that has been involved in this, thank you for your patience. Thanks for your commitment at seeing through, making time to do 4 of these sessions with us. Thank you for your questions and interaction. It's really helped make all of these sessions be, we hope, more attuned to what people would like to hear from us. So it won't be the last of this. There will doubtless be further installments in this once the legislation gets bedded in and we start to see how it's working out in practice. But for now, from myself and Gemma, thank you very much. And if you found it useful, we've been Forbes solicitors. And if it's been an utter waste of your time, then insert name of other firm here, and that'll be fine. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everybody.
And good luck with the rest of the day.
Take care. Bye.